Many times when people think of the 1920s, they think of the era of Prohibition. Gangsters, the Valentine's Day Massacre, bootleggers. There's a lot of romanticizing when it comes to Prohibition about this idea of people going and sneaking into the speakeasies, knocking on the door and saying, "Hey, Sharky sent me." And you go inside, you have jazz music and flappers and people smoking in public and drinking illegal whiskey and flaunting the laws. And while that is certainly true to some degree, um, it really was not as widespread as people think. So, prohibition. I guess probably the biggest idea is what was prohibition and why would the government do this to us? All right. And I probably should predicate by all this by saying when I talk about alcohol is understand I don't drink. Okay. So I probably should always put that in on any video where I talk about alcohol is I don't drink. The prohibition was the United States government attempt to change some social behaviors. For example, prohibition really was not about the alcohol. If it had been, then maybe they would have made drinking alcohol illegal, but it wasn't. It was the law actually said the manufacture, the distribution of alcohol, and so if you made, and in fact you could get in your Sears and Roebuck catalog and order your own still to make your own alcohol, as long as you didn't try to sell it, you were not breaking the law. You could always use alcohol for religious and medical purposes. So you could go to your doctor and you could get a prescription for whiskey and go down to the pharmacist. The pharmacist would sell you a fifth of whiskey and say, "Here, go and be better." All right. That wasn't about the alcohol. Prohibition was really all about America's social ills. I want you to think about some things, okay? According to a video that I've linked to by Ken Burns, where he talks about the amount of alcohol Americans were consuming. I want you to think the average 15-year-old American prior to Prohibition was drinking 88 bottles of whiskey a year. Okay, at 15. We spent more money on alcohol prior to Prohibition. Americans spent more money on alcohol than the entire U.S. government budget. Over one out of every $5 in this country was spent on booze, which means that money was not being spent on rent. And women especially suffered the ill effects of this behavior, of these social ills. There was a lot of instances of that men would go off, they would get drunk in the saloon on Friday night, and they would come home and they would be absolutely horrible to their family, be absolutely terribly abusive to their family. There was massive homelessness, massive alcoholism in our country. The number of people who were dying of liver disease was actually the number one cause of death in our country was liver disease. And all these things you can actually go back and you can verify using the CDC websites. You can use some different other websites. History.com has some great links to it as well. So I don't think I'm saying anything that's like just out there, conspiracy theory. So they were like, well, okay, you know what? There were no laws against abusing your spouse or abusing your children. It was perfectly legal. And so women, as they were becoming more politically powerful, used that power to try to protect other women by outlawing alcohol because they blamed the alcohol for the social ill. They figured that if you weren't spending the money on alcohol, then you would be maybe spending the money on paying rent or buying groceries or shoes or whatever it is. And the idea being that perhaps there'd be less child poverty, less deprivation of humanity because of this alcoholism. All right? And it worked. The United States spent a lot more money on alcohol before Prohibition than it does even today. In fact, if you were to add up the amount of money spent on alcohol in, say, the 1830s adjusted for inflation, it comes out to be something like 3 times higher than the amount of money Americans spend on alcohol and all other drugs today. And so it really did work. The only reason we got rid of it wasn't because of speakeasies or because of gangsters, and it didn't create these gangsters. All right, the gangsters like the mob, they existed before. You know, Al Capone was already wanted for murder and had already beaten the racket 2 or 3 times before Prohibition went into effect. He just saw this Prohibition as an opportunity to make a little bit more money for himself. And he did. And in fact, he made so much money, but he didn't pay taxes, so he goes to prison, not for murder because they never could find a witness that would stand up to him, but for tax evasion, where the only witness he has is his own house, car, clothes, and other things that he could not afford as a shoe salesman, which is what he told the IRS he was. So, anyways, going back to this, this doesn't create mafia culture. It doesn't create the mob. In fact, if you read, and because I'm a huge fan of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, there's multiple stories written in the 1890s where Sherlock Holmes is talking about the Italian mafia and the New York mafia. And that's 30 years before Prohibition. So it didn't create the gang culture. But what it does do is it emboldens them because it gives them a new revenue source. And so that revenue source, of course, was illegal sale and distribution of alcohol. Anyway, so after Prohibition goes into effect, we do see a very quick decline in the number of people who die of liver-related, alcohol-related disorders. We do see a decline in homelessness until the Great Depression. And we see a lot of things that the social ills do decline somewhat. So why did we ever get rid of Prohibition? Well, Franklin Roosevelt got rid of Prohibition in the 1930s because it was the Great Depression. And the United States government needed the money. So the Prohibition was not repealed because it didn't work. Prohibition was repealed because our government needed the revenue. They needed the tax revenue. And if you still look at alcohol today, I understand that a huge amount of the price of alcohol are actually taxes to go and pay for social programs like treatment centers for alcoholism. So anyway, so Prohibition, 1920s, they seem to go together. And with good reason. It was a time period of Prohibition. And I think that there are so many people who talk bad about Prohibition because this was the first real attempt on a big scale of our government to try to control individual behaviors. You know, before, individual behaviors were kind of left up to the individuals. And corporate behaviors were monitored by the government and were trying to be corrected during the progressive era. But this was going to be one of those times when they're really going to try to correct individual behaviors. And so I think that we as Americans don't like our government telling us how we're supposed to act. They always say you can't legislate morality. So I think that that's a big part of why people don't like Prohibition. The other thing I think that people don't like Prohibition because ever since the 1980s, Prohibition has been compared to America's war on drugs, and with its success or lack of success, depending on how you look at it. So I think that there's a lot to be said for that. But I think that how we look at Prohibition is really largely based on our 2020 perspective, not on our 1920 perspective. So until then, don't forget to check out the videos on 1920 peace, 1920 prosperity, and 1920s prejudice. And so until then, I will see you in class.